Well,
Thanks for having me.
I have good news and bad news. The good news is you now have a home and a family. The bad news is you now are booked this time in January for the rest of your life, which is the great part of DLD. I'm really excited for this conversation because it's such an important conversation. You know, I've covered Silicon Valley for 25 years, and the one thing we can be sure of is that the tech industry will keep producing amazing technology, but that technology can go for good or for not. And the new technologies, and I want to pick up exactly where you went, Werner, but I do want to bring in both the old AI and the new AI, and really get a sense of how do we make sure that when you're up here in 5 years, you have a similar set of examples of how generative AI has produced good outcomes, and it isn't an asterisk next to all the harm. So I guess maybe to start, what is it that you both think the technology will evolve and do, and what is it that we as humans need to do to get that same list of outcomes for generative AI?
So why don't I jump in, because I think let's give Werner another hand and a little bit of a breather. It's an amazing presentation. You really covered the entire waterfront from, I mean, we went all the way back to Aristotle and here we are today. So that's a pretty monumental feat, but just water, and it's a long way to travel in a short period of time. Let me just talk to you a minute about why I was so excited about coming to DLD and how I very much appreciate the invitation is because of people like Werner and the work that he's doing. I think we're at this moment that how I like to think about it is with AI is around standards, solutions, and scale. Now, normally in other technologies, these things happen sequentially. You build a policy arm, you build pilots and some solutions, and then you really scale the things that are both legal and work. I think in this particular moment in history, we're at a moment with this technology where it's all happening at the same time. And what that means is people like me, people like Werner, people like you who are here, we have a very unique moment to try to align incentives for any of our organizations, any of the things that we're doing in a way that propels this technology for better, not for worse. That we actually try on the front end to make this technology work for us, not against us. And so to your question, Ina, how did these ideas become, and I would call these ideas sort of solutions that have great potential to scale, but what are we doing to ensure that these solutions scale? And I think that's the reason why a company like Mastercard would even come to a conference like this, because when you're looking at a platform that does have scale, 200 markets, over 186 transactions that we have to protect, you have to look at this in a way that says people are going to come after your money first, and they already have. We were talking about the phishing scams that are getting smarter on our own WhatsApp and things like that. That's a place where a company like ours, companies like AWS and Amazon, companies that you all are running in partnership with government and social sector organizations sort of have to step in and step up right now if we're going to ensure that this entire system creates the incentives to create a better place, not a worse place.
And Werner, when you look at generative AI in particular, what are the things that it's just doing great, we just need to sit back and enjoy the ride, if any, and where are the things where we really need to step in and say, if we want to have that list of great outcomes, what is it we need to do?
Well, I think first and foremost, it always starts with the data itself, of course. I mean, we need to make sure we have good data available. So if you want, as always, I think, at technologists, we have developed tools. Just have everybody, we've been developing tools forever. Not just technology. And it depends all on society and humans itself, how we're using these tools. If I look at things like image recognition, for example, there's many different, the bad guys are using the same tools as that the good guys are. And so if you really think about an organization or a data set like Digital Africa, which is basically all satellite imagery of Africa over the years. Governments can use that data set to find, for example, illegal mining. Yeah, new roads that are being built to areas where you shouldn't think there needs to be a road, or mangrove erosion, or the impact of forest fires, or all these kind of things that work really well. Yeah, and so it depends on how you use the technology. It's a bit like what shall I say, steel. Steel is there to make incubators that makes baby survive. It also make guns. It's society that determines what is appropriate use of that or not. Think about image recognition. London probably has 100,000 CCTV cameras, and nobody complains about that. Try to do the same thing in Amsterdam or in Berlin or in Munich, you'll get a revolution. It's not going to happen. The society is not on board with that particular site, and that's just a few hundred kilometers from here, where society thinks very differently about that. Think about the US versus Europe. And as such, I think it all depends on rebuilding the tools, but we need to make sure the tools are accurate. Yeah, that's definitely. We need to make sure, and accuracy all depends a lot on what is the input set. You know, garbage in creates garbage out.
And garbage is suggesting that it's universally good or bad. And one of the things I want to point out is, and I want to spend some minutes on data because I think it's super important. It's also, you know, what is great data for white males living in America is garbage for much of the world. Yeah. And one of the things I'm struck by is, as powerful as these generative AI systems are, they very much reflect an imbalance of where that data is collected from.
Yeah. Every year I put out a number of technology predictions. One of them is, this year, is around what I call culturally aware large language models. You know, it's not just, I mean, we can do translation perfectly. I mean, I can talk on the phone, translate it to text, translate that into Spanish, and have a Spanish person being on the other side of the line. That's the real-time stuff we're going to do. It's not just about language. It's about the cultural embodiment that sits in our bodies of work. And the example I always try to give is sort of, if you ask the current LLMs to summarize a book from Isabel Allende, you get a very different answer than an LLM that's trained on South America data, because they look very differently at that. You know, our cultural embodiment is something that we as humans, we can gauge this stuff. You know, if someone in Greece spits on the wedding dress, yeah, we no longer think like, ooh, that's wrong. No, it's a sign of wishing them good luck. Yeah. And so these kind of embodies, we can figure these things out. These LLMs have culture based in them because they're largely current one, the ones they're using, are all trained on Western data in English.
And Shamina, I'm curious, you know, you have tremendous access to data, you've seen it, you've done some work in addition to your Mastercard work. Mastercard's done a lot of work with Dataorg. Dataorg, is that right?
Yeah, exactly.
Talk about how do we get, like, it's one thing to recognize the problem, and I don't think it's universally appreciated just how much bias is in these LLMs because they reflect society. How do we, you know, first, I think the first step's recognizing it, but how do we start to address it?
So I think that the biases don't reflect society, right? It's like currently that's the problem, is that the data doesn't reflect actual society. And so I think that the opportunity here, again, as we talk about aligning incentives, is it means that we're also going to have to create new institutions to deal with the new possibilities. I think Werner so rightly talks about data as the engine for all of this. We created an organization in partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation called Dataorg, whose sole purpose is to build the capacity of social sector organizations to realize the power of data. Because what usually happens in these scenarios when there's an incredible revolution of information, the people who are impacted in the worst way and are hit the hardest are usually at the back of the line to actually receive the benefit of the data. And so again, as big actors, as private sector actors in the space, it's actually our responsibility to ensure that the same things that we're producing for profit with our partners, we're actually also keeping in mind that the profitability extends to all segments of society. So the purpose of Dataorg is a new organization. It's a new institution to ensure that the data haves and the data have-nots don't contribute to a widening, not wealth gap, but a widening information inequality gap that we are seeing happen more and more. What does that look like? So I just want to talk a minute about data.org, because I do think at some point, I hope data.org will come to DLD. But basically, the idea is that the data, what it looks like ultimately is that we focus on 3 areas. On talent, so we're now investing millions of dollars and a lot of capability, a lot of employee engagement work from our institutions to actually go to, in the United States, they're called historically black colleges and universities. So we're investing in the infrastructure of HBCUs, Hispanic serving institutions, and institutions that primarily educate women to ensure that on the front end of these data sets and the learning models that are happening, we're actually creating the skills and we're creating the people to create these models on the front end so that they can benefit first, not last. The second thing I want to say is, it wasn't featured here, but I do hope that we'll talk about him maybe next year here, is Manu Chopra. Who, I don't know if anybody has heard of Manu and what he's doing with Garia in India, but he's actually created an organization that works with many private sector companies so that Indians are training the language models using Indian languages, not Hindi, but those that are also spoken in India. And the difference is he pays them a living wage to do this work, which is very different from many of the language models that are being created now. So it's really worth looking at the supply chain of the data that's being created. And he's also done something that we have also created on the principal side, which is that you should benefit from the data that you're putting out into the universe. And so he actually is allowing or enabling these same workers to get paid whenever their language model is used. Those are the kinds of incentives that I think if we build in right now, those might become the things that get us to a place where we're creating data for impact instead of the other way around.
And I'm curious,
Yeah, sorry if I can actually, because I think education in this particular part is extremely important. I think one of the downsides of a compressed adoption cycle, technology adoption cycle, remember that in the past this used to be decades. Yeah? Spreadsheets we developed, Physical in the 60s, it didn't come to life as commercial products in the 80s, Lotus 123, Excel, now there's apparently only one winner left in that particular space, but it took decades to actually figure out for businesses how should we use this technology, what's the role of it. If we totally compress that adoption cycle by handing out new technology straight out of the lab in the hands of consumers, we also have a responsibility for education at the same time, to educate the general public about the capabilities of it and what the risks are. That I think if it does hallucinations, it still means that you need to use your brain as a human looking at this. You still need to fact check it yourself. Those things don't disappear. Yeah? Engineers that are coming out of a 4-year institution today have no clue about this technology that actually their employers want them to work on. So what we see is a shift happening where it's actually private companies that do the education versus the 4-year institutions. The 4-year institutions are still amazing. The degree is something worth. It helps you think, it helps you abstract, it makes you look at bigger pictures, it teaches you to learn. But it is at the company or at the institution that you're going to work at that you actually still get the training to what you really do. At Amazon, and we do this also outside of Amazon, of course, we have already in the past years trained 21 million engineers on AI and AI-related technologies. Why? Because the world is moving so fast, educational institutions can't keep up with that. Another effect of this compressed adoption cycle in not doing the education is that governments and regulatory agencies are getting this knee-jerk reaction because they're not fully informed. They're not fully educated. And it's our responsibility, which I think has been a little bit lacking in overall this, if you actually bring this technology out into the wild, into the open, which I still think is at the level of what I call a dancing bear. We're all amazed that this bear can dance. We're not really looking whether it dances well or not. Yeah? And
or whether it's actually a bear.
We need to understand exactly what the risk and where it works on and where it doesn't work. We need to educate people about that. And that's something that's been sort of been sort of on the sideline more at the moment, then it's sort of in the middle. And without that, we do not get good regulations, and we do not get good government support if you do not do the education.
You took me to two places that I wanted to make sure we hit. One is, this you called it a compressed cycle, and it really is. I mean, I think one of the things that's so different is, this didn't arrive first in the wealthiest, nerdiest consumers or first in enterprise. It's out there for everyone. It's very accessible. Most new technologies require a level of expertise just to play around with them. And this does it, which creates some great opportunities. And I think in some ways, I'm glad, since it's developing so fast, that the whole world is getting to try it out. But that also means its impacts are arriving much more quickly. And one of the issues that gets some attention, but I think needs a lot, is this idea of misinformation. And you pointed, what the technology we need most is up here. How do we transform a global society in a very short period of time to not believe what we see and hear when we've relied on that for all of human existence?
That's the biggest challenge, actually, more than the technology itself.
I would just say that I think that that's actually a brilliant point. For many folks who might be going to Davos after this, the World Economic Forum released their 2024 risk report just last week. The number one risk that people are worried about is this idea of misinformation and what's going to happen with AI. That has sort of, I mean, in some respects, I think climate change was the first one last year. This year, it's misinformation. And I think part of the way that we are dealing with this is that we actually don't think about it as a they-we situation. We are the ones who have to figure this out. That's why we're in rooms like this today, is that this can't rely on other people to figure it out, including government or public sector or private sector. So one of the things that I think is important is also to recognize that incumbents, those companies, those organizations who've been working in the space for many years, are actually ensuring that they're building this with principles and guardrails in place on the front end. And so what does that look like? So I would just say that, as before I came here, I asked my colleagues, what does the fraud rate look like with transactions? And part of this is as consumers are playing around with this or recognizing whether this is a dancing bear, you want to make sure that you're still able to pay for things and you're still able to deal in the world in a way that that's easy for you. I talked to my colleagues before I came, and they said, look, we started investing in AI over a decade ago, because what is AI on the data other than pattern recognition? And so they said, if we could identify fraud, the patterns of fraud, we could build the new models in such a way that detect it. Over the last 3 years, my colleagues have defended about almost $40 billion worth of transactions. And that's out of 186 billion transactions that happen every year. I think what we're trying to do here is say, look, we've been doing this for a while. It's not necessarily the new technology that is the issue. I think the issue is, for those who have been doing it, how do we ensure that we're maintaining the principles and the responsibilities on the front end?
And I'm curious whether the approach that we're taking is working. And you mentioned regulation, and we'll get to regulation, but just with the way that the technology is rolling out. So you have a few companies like OpenAI that have closed systems. You have companies like Meta and Facebook pushing out the technology as open source and saying, well, it's going to be used for good, it's going to be used for bad. I feel like we've heard that story before, and it didn't work out that well in social media, and I'm worried just hoping that it's used for more good than bad isn't sufficient.
I mean, it's after all the human intent. I mean, if you look at social media, what we don't like about social media is both the misinformation, people using it for different purposes, and just the garbage that is just being put out by people. And by the way, what you consider garbage may be different in terms of demographic or geographic location or whatever. So that's all of that. It's, after all, I think social media are the reflection of what we have as a society. Yeah, and society is not pretty everywhere. Do I think we can solve this with technology? Partly. But also partly there are always people that will have bad intent. And my phishing emails have become so much better in the past year. Yeah, bad guys know exactly how to use this technology. I recently encountered something with this myself. I have a personal email domain, and suddenly I saw a whole range of tests against different usernames. And what was that? And people that are associated with me. So what they're doing is they're actually taking one person, take all your social media info, all the blogging info that is out there, and basically build a family tree or your associate tree with you, and then try to see whether that particular information can be used to break into accounts.
And that's, we're going to see it for profit. We're already seeing it for phishing, but I also think, am I naive? Am I not naive? Am I overly skeptical? Am I too worried that governments in elections, Cambridge Analytica happened before all this. I can imagine very targeted messaging from politicians, from authoritarian governments that are geared towards making people take a particular action. Am I wrong to be worried about that?
Well, even before this, you should have been worried about this. Yeah, after all, even before we disseminated most of our information through the internet, because most of our information out of newspapers. Newspapers, at least in Europe, they had where there's a left wing as a middle and a right wing one, and depending on which one you get confirmation bias. As long as you hear the stories that actually match your beliefs, it only gets amplified. So this is something that has happened, but the thing here is that the technology is happening so fast. I think mostly from a competitive point of view. That's why this technology is being pushed out so fast, because there's so many companies working in this particular area. That we, at the same time, don't have the responsibility as technology company to educate the larger public. And we need to educate about what works really well and what doesn't work. I mean, if you look at healthcare, for example, Sweden has a national, I think most Western European countries have these public programs against breast cancer. So you get every 2 years, you get a mammogram, get scanned. This basically means that the radiologists need to look at tens of thousands of these mammograms. Yeah? And they built AI that does the same thing. Or AI, the old AI, image recognition. Image recognition, or that AI system, and this data in Sweden uses these public data, does 30% better than a single radiologist and as good as 2 radiologists. Now, it doesn't mean you take the radiologist out. They still need to do the check. After all, it's AI that predicts. We as humans decide. It's still input into our world, and we decide whether to accept that and believe that or use that. Yeah? I mean, we're both in the business of doing transactions. We literally at Amazon Retail sit in billions of transactions from the past. We build a model out of that, continuously updating the model because fraud changes. Every order goes through that, and we give it a score, a likelihood that this is a fraudulent order. If we decide it meets sort of a threshold, it's a human that's going to investigate. Now, we don't automatically reject this transaction. Now, it's still us humans that make decisions. These are tools to help us. And as such, we as humans need to make sure that we're educated about the capabilities of the technology and also what the negative use of it is.
So we only have a tiny bit of time, and I want to give people some homework. Usually I try and end on positive, but I feel like we all have a role to play. What's one thing you would like this incredibly insightful, powerful audience to do to take action?
So I'll just jump in here and say, look, I'll start. I want to finish where I started, which is this is the moment to align our incentives. So if there is one thing that any of us take away from this is that this is not going to happen in isolation. We have to collaborate across sectors, across silos. And so if you haven't worked with, if you sit in social sector, please get involved with Data.org. If you want to work with private sector, call us as the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth. Talk to Amazon, talk to government. But I think in this moment, we cannot look inward. We have to work together and look outward to ensure that this technology works for us, not against us.
One practical one. If you have an online platform, contact foreign and make sure that there is no sexual exploitation material on your platform, ever. Yeah, this is a practical tip. It's a massive problem in our world. When talking to foreign on calls with them, it's mind-blowing how big this problem is. We all have a role to play there. There's technology out there that can help protect children. Use it.
Well, thank you very much. I want to give you one more piece of homework. If you don't get my daily newsletter, I do my colleague Ryan Heath, a daily newsletter for Axios. You can go to aiplus.axios.com. So the first part of the homework is do sign up. Let me know what we're getting right, what we're not talking enough about. That's the real homework is, make sure that we're having these discussions. And I look forward to coming back to DLD next year.
Thank you.
Thank you.